Okay, in this video we're going to look at the differences between headline and underlying inflation and what one includes that the other doesn't. But before we get on to that, here's just a little question that's is a bit trickier and gets to sort of think a little bit differently. So over 2014, the transport category within the consumer price index fell 1.9%. Provide a possible explanation for the fall in transport prices and briefly explain why this did not lead to deflation. Okay, the way to go about answering this question is that, first of all, over the second half of 2014, the main reason the transport category fell was because of oversupply of oil, which led to falls in oil prices. So that meant that the transport category within the CPI fell because petrol was less expensive. But it didn't cause deflation because transport's only one category. There's 11 categories within the CPI, and transport only makes up around 12%. So the other categories must have increased for deflation not occur. So the other categories must have increased over 2014 on average, such that the annual rate of inflation was still above zero, or still above 0%, or didn't occur deflation. So if you get a similar question about, how can property prices decrease but we don't experience deflation, or so on and so forth, it's because, there are 11 different categories. So it's the general level of prices we're thinking of, not just one good or service. So headline inflation. Headline inflation is measured by the CPI. So the consumer price index is what we've been calculating, and that measures headline inflation. It captures the price changes of all 100,000 goods and services in the CPI. That's what headline inflation does. Underlying inflation starts with the 100,000 goods and services and then removes one-off or volatile items. So what I mean by that is if the price of some goods goes up by a lot or goes down by a lot, it gets rid of them. So if we have a cyclone or a natural disaster that destroys a lot of our agriculture, the underlying rate of inflation will take out the effects of those higher prices for like fruit and vegetables and things like that because they're volatile. If petrol prices go up by a lot, or even if they go down by a lot, they will get taken out. If there's something that, like an indirect tax, like an excise tax or something like that, put on alcohol or tobacco, those prices will become volatile and therefore they'll be taken out of the underlying rate of inflation. The underlying is kind of like the core rate of inflation once we take out volatile items. So, for example, here are a range of factors, and here are some things that would impact the headline but not underlying. That impact both headline and underlying inflation. So most of the demand side factors, because they will cause prices across the economy to change, so interest rate changes, the dollar changing, overseas growth, they're not just affecting one good or service, they're going to affect the general level of prices, so they will impact both the headline and the underlying rate of inflation. But things that are going to cause one-off factors, or they're just going to cause the price of some things to go up, generally they'll be excluded from the underlying headline. So they will not be included in the underlying, but they will be included in headline. So indirect taxes, the carbon tax, petrol excise taxes, those sort of things are likely to cause an increase in headline inflation but not underlying inflation. If the GST is just put onto one more item, so if they broaden the tax base and put it on fresh fruit, for example, that wouldn't really affect the headline rate. Natural disasters that destroy crops and agriculture, again, one industry. Lower petrol prices, lower tariffs on beef are really only going to change beef prices. If there's a milk price war, it's only affecting milk really, so it will only affect the headline but not the underlying. So basically you're looking at things that are going to cause a one-off spike in the prices of some goods and services. They will be removed from the underlying rate of inflation. When is the headline rate likely to be higher than the underlying rate? Well, basically the headline rate will be higher when the prices of some things is going up, because they will be included in volatile things, because they'll be included in the headline but not the underlying. So if we put an excise tax on tobacco, that will be included in the CPI and therefore will cause the headline rate to go up, but it won't affect underlying. If there's a natural disaster that affects just banana prices, that will affect headline, but it won't affect underlying. If petrol prices increase or there's a carbon tax, that will affect headline but not underlying. But the underlying can also be higher than the headline, and the underlying will be higher than the headline when the price of volatile items is going down, because the downward fall in those volatile items will be included in the headline but not in the underlying. So at the moment the underlying is slightly higher, and that's because petrol prices are relatively low. That's getting included in headline but not underlying. Fruit and vegetable prices are falling. For example, after we recover from a cyclone, that would be included in headline but not underlying. So the headline would go down but the underlying wouldn't. Okay. The two types of underlying inflation, we've got what we call the weighted mean and the trimmed mean. The weighted mean is basically, it takes the price changes of what fits in the middle group. So it's kind of like taking the median price and seeing whether the median price in the CPI is going up or down. So all the prices in sort of the 50 percentile or in the middle, are their prices going up or down? The underlying measure is basically the headline, or the CPI, then takes out the prices that go up the most, the top 15%, and the prices that go down the most, the bottom 15%, to see if the prices in the 70% in the middle are going up or down. As you can see here, so for example, in 2011 when we had the big cyclone, you can see that the headline rate of inflation went above 3% because the price of a lot of agricultural products went up, but it didn't really have any impact on the underlying rate of inflation because those prices got taken out and therefore they weren't included within the underlying rate of inflation. So you can see there's a big difference there when something like a natural disaster occurs. Okay, again, you can see discrepancies here. The headline is lower here because of lower petrol prices than the underlying. We're back sort of towards, in other areas, there may have been one-off increases in prices which meant the headline rate was higher. Why do we remove volatile or one-off increases? Because it gives us a better indication of whether there's an ongoing inflationary pressures. So once the volatile things are removed, underlying inflation gives a better indication of the persistent underlying price changes. Okay, last to finish off, higher oil prices impact both headline and underlying inflation, but impact headline by more. Why is this the case? Okay, the reason for that is, well, oil as itself is something that's brought, or petrol is actually brought by consumers. So the fact that oil and petrol prices are going down, they're directly included in the CPI. Within the transport category, they're included in the CPI. So that one-off price of petrol or oil will be removed from the underlying rate because it would be considered a volatile item. So in that case, it would affect the headline rate but not the underlying because the price of the oil going down or petrol going down would be removed from the underlying. But why would underlying still get affected? Well, that sort of stems from the fact that lower petrol prices or lower oil prices will cause reduced transport prices across the whole economy. So if the price of transport goes down, lots of other goods like bread and milk and coffee and other things that get transported, so cars that get transported, all their prices are likely to go down because the costs of production go down. And you can't remove everything, so those things would actually be included as part of the headline and the underlying rate. So the fact that the general price level goes down will affect the underlying, but just the direct impact of petrol prices would only affect the headline.